In June 1941, I was back in London. My ship had been sunk under me in the Battle of Crete. Most of my flotilla had been sunk or damaged, and I was waiting for another job. But first, I had a special mission. I had been instructed by the Commanders-in-Chief Middle East, that was Field Marshal Wavell, Admiral Cunningham, and Air Chief Marshal Tedder, to report personally to the Prime Minister their views on the situation out there. So my first port of call was Whitehall. I didn't realize then how well I was going to get to know this nerve center of the war. The Prime Minister asked me to lunch at number 10 Downing Street on Saturday, June the 21st. Lunch was laid in what was then his downstairs dining room, and we collected beforehand at this garden entrance. The only other person present was Lord Beaverbrook. Winston Churchill arrived about 20 minutes late, and he had once informed us that he had definite information that the Germans were going to attack Russia on the 22nd of June. In fact, the next day.
At 4 o'clock this morning, Hitler attacked and invaded Russia. Suddenly, without declaration of war, without even an ultimatum, the German bombs rained down from the sky upon the Russian cities. The German troops violated the Russian frontiers. A state of war existed between Germany and Russia.
Winston Churchill then continued with words which are among the most historic of all his speeches, words which defined the new shape of the war.
Any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. Any man or state who marches with Hitler is our foe. That is our policy, and that is our declaration. It follows, therefore, that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and to the Russian people.
Hitler's invasion of Russia produced exactly opposite results to those intended. A long, drawn-out campaign against a stubborn enemy, and the forging of what Churchill called the Grand Alliance. It was the ultimate unity of Britain, Russia, and the United States which brought about the fall of the dictators. At Placentia Bay, Newfoundland, in August 1941, only 6 weeks after the German attack on Russia, another long step towards the Grand Alliance was taken. America was not yet at war, but at Placentia Bay, President Roosevelt committed his still neutral country to the cause of anti-Nazism as deeply as he dared. And from this meeting also emerged the declaration of war aims of the free world, the Atlantic Charter. In this same month, August 1941, Mountbatten was in America. The crack aircraft carrier Illustrious, severely damaged in Malta, was being repaired in the U.S. Navy Yard at Norfolk, Virginia. Mountbatten was appointed captain of this splendid ship. Although it would be some time before she was ready to sail again, he took up his new command with great elation.
I'm looking forward, as I'm sure all of you are, to getting back into the war again as soon as possible and to handing out a few more knocks to the Germans and the Italians. There wasn't a lot for me to do on board while the Illustrious was refitting, so I was delighted to be invited to visit the U.S. Pacific Fleet and lecture to the officers about what the war at sea was like. The fleet base was Pearl Harbor, over 2,000 miles out in the Pacific Ocean from San Francisco. After 2 years of war, I was rather appalled to see how unprepared the Americans were and how vulnerable to a surprise attack.
In October 1941, Mountbatten received a signal from London. Prime Minister to Lord Louis Mountbatten, We want you home here at once for something which you will find of the highest interest.
When I got back to England, I went straight to Chequers, and Winston told me that I was to be the advisor on combined operations. I can't have looked very pleased, because he said to me rather truculently, "Well, what have you got to say to that?" I said I'd sooner be back at sea in the Illustrious. That really made him snort. "Have you no sense of glory? Here I give you a chance to take an active part in the higher leadership of the war, and all you want to do is to go back to sea. What could you hope to achieve except to be sunk in a bigger and more expensive ship?" So that was that. No further argument. And on the 27th of October, I took over combined ops from Admiral of the Fleet Lord Keyes and came to work in this office, here, borrowed from Scotland Yard.
Combined Operations Command in October 1941 had been in existence for 15 months. It was born in adversity in the dark days of June 1940. Britain then was preparing for invasion. Our expeditionary force had been expelled from Europe at Dunkirk. Her ally France was crumbling. Her defenses were pitifully weak. Her cities were being evacuated and barricaded. Her citizens, banded together in the local defense volunteers, later known as the Home Guard, were preparing to resist the invader with whatever arms they could find, and these were few. Everyone was thinking of defense. Churchill proclaimed Britain's defiance of the enemy in the House of Commons with fighting words, yet the hard core of their meaning was defensive. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. But Churchill's mind could never be satisfied with such a program. While the German armies poured through France and lined up along the shores facing England, at the moment when Hitler's might seemed most invincible and menacing, Churchill was also saying, "We have got to get out of our minds the idea that the Channel ports and all the country between them are enemy territory." He demanded a vigorous, enterprising and ceaseless offensive against the whole German-occupied coastline. He wanted a reign of terror along the Channel shore, carried out by specially trained troops of the Hunter class.
I was one of those troops of the Hunter class, commandos in fact. We came into being in June 1940. I was a number 3 commando. H Troop, in which I was a second lieutenant, consisted of men, for the most part, from the Army Reserve. Real soldiers, young, but experienced, preeminent for their skill at arms. Some seemed to me, at the ripe age of 25, to be very young soldiers. But all were imbued with a great spirit. The training was tough, and got tougher as time went by. There was great emphasis on self-reliance and physical fitness. A commando training center was set up, where every recruit was put through a rigorous course. Above all, in our tactical thinking, we sought for originality and surprise. The commando role was raiding, but in the summer of 1940, it was far from easy to lay on even a minor raid. Much of the European coast was simply out of range. There were no suitable landing craft, and we had to use RAF crash boats, whose bows were so high that one landed up to one's neck in water. Most disconcerting. There were only 40 Tommy guns in the whole country, but even so, our first raid was carried out on June the 23rd, only 19 days after Dunkirk.
The first director of combined operations was Churchill's old friend, Admiral of the Fleet, Lord Keyes. His eager spirit hatched many bold ideas. But in 1940 and 41, every part of the war effort was making urgent demands for equipment. British production figures might double or treble themselves. There was still never enough to go round. Time after time, Keyes found his plans thwarted. The old admiral blamed the chiefs of staff and didn't mince his words. By October 1941, Churchill had concluded that the appointment of a new and young figure would be in the public interest.
It was embarrassing for me, a mere captain, to have to take over from this famous admiral of the fleet, who'd served under my father, and who'd been kind to me when he was the commander-in-chief of the Mediterranean fleet, and I was a junior two-striper on his staff in the 1920s. Lord Keyes was very friendly about the turnover, but naturally sad and upset. Dickie, he said, the trouble is the British have lost the will to fight. The chiefs of staff are the greatest cowards I've ever met. I believe he told them that to their faces, so no wonder he and they fell out. Anyway, Winston had given me my directive, and now it was up to me. This is part of the complex of offices underneath Whitehall, where the War Cabinet and the Defense Committee used to meet and sleep in the days when London was a prime target for the Luftwaffe and Hitler's V weapons. Some of these rooms are still preserved exactly as they used to be. This is the operations room, which was manned night and day all through the war. This is the room where the War Cabinet used to meet. And this is Winston's bedroom. And when I had to see him at night or in the early morning, it would often be in this room. He would either be at this desk, or more likely, sitting up in bed with a cigar, his spectacles on the end of his nose, wearing his quilted dressing gown, and with papers all over the bed. My task, Winston told me, was twofold. I was to continue the commando raids in order to keep up the offensive spirit, to gain essential experience, and to harass the enemy. But above all, I was to prepare in every possible way for the great counter-invasion of Europe, although everyone else still believed our backs were to the wall. Winston summed up my job in one sentence. I want you to turn the south coast of England from a bastion of defense into a springboard for attack. So from now onwards, my main preoccupation was this vast combined operation, which was to be the climax of the war. I don't think anyone appreciated just how enormous it was, or how complex all the problems would prove to be. But bit by bit, we found out. And bit by bit, we overcame them.
The eyes of the world in October and November 1941 were on the Russian front. If Russia fell, Britain would be alone in the war again, and all her hopeful plans would be shelved once more. It seemed that Russia might easily fall. Leningrad was besieged. Kiev, Kharkov, and Rostov were in German hands. In mid-November, with the thermometer dropping to below zero, the Germans launched the final attack on Moscow. By December the 2nd, they were in the suburbs of the Russian capital. And there they stopped. Without special equipment for winter fighting, without even winter clothing, Hitler's armies were trapped in the snow as Napoleon had been in 1812. And then, to the world's astonishment, the Russians struck back. Stalin had already admitted to 1 3/4 million casualties and huge losses of equipment. And yet, the Russians struck back. Hitler, for the first time, was on the defensive. On December the 7th came the second turning point of the war, Pearl Harbor. Hot on the news of the Russian counterattack came the staggering shock of Japan's aggression and the virtual destruction of the American Pacific Fleet inside its base. A new enemy, a fresh defeat. That was the short-term view. The long-term view was different. I could not foretell the course of events, wrote Churchill. I do not pretend to have measured accurately the martial might of Japan. But now, at this very moment, I knew the United States was in the war, up to the neck and into the death. So we had won, after all.
What a typically Churchillian way of looking at an event which had all the hallmarks of disaster, because it wasn't simply the American Pacific Fleet which sustained terrible damage on December the 7th. The Japanese attacked us at the same time. On the same day as Pearl Harbor, they bombed Hong Kong. The next day, they landed in Malaya. 2 days after that, our two great ships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, were sunk off Singapore. On December the 17th, the Japanese invaded Borneo. It looked as though they might even get into Australia and New Zealand. There wasn't very much to stop them. One after another, all these shocks and catastrophes were recorded on these maps here in the War Cabinet's operations room, the nerve center of our war. From the immediate point of view, this was the worst moment so far. Yet Winston was right. We had won the war because now we knew that the full resources of American manpower and American production would be behind us. To me, that meant everything. I just spent 5 weeks taking stock of my new assignment and realized that the root of all our problems was the absolute shortage of every single thing that we needed. But with America mobilized, all that would change. So now Combined Operations Headquarters could really begin to think big.
In December 1941, Combined Ops carried out the double raid on Lofoten and Vågsø in Norway. Lofoten was a return visit. Our forces encountered little opposition and did the Germans a lot of damage. Vågsø cost us 20 killed and 57 wounded, besides several planes. Nevertheless, it was a classic raid in a small way. I was in command of one of two troops detailed to capture a key coast defense battery. It's like a sort of maritime charge of the Light Brigade, but at least by this time we had armored landing craft, the LCA, and the supporting fire of HMS Kenyon, which knocked hell out of the battery as we approached. My troop landed unopposed and took 3 of the guns before the Germans emerged from their bunkers. After a time, some of us were sent to assist Group 1, which had got held up in street fighting. Of many incidents, the most dangerous, I think, was the storming of the Red Warehouse on the steamship wharf. There were not many Germans inside, but one could only get at them through a narrow door, stepping in out of the daylight into pitch darkness. We committed the building, a wooden one, to the flames and pushed on, leaving 2 men with a Bren to watch the door. When it got stuffy, the Germans came out. That's the sort of fight it was for 4 hours that morning. Perhaps any good infantry could have done the job, but I doubt if many could have done it in the time. This was the first raid of the Mountbatten period and set off the new regime on a high note of endeavor and achievement. It was the first time that all 3 services had cooperated in this way, and it showed what could be done. There were other raids after this, but our first really big effort took place on March 28, 1942, the raid on Saint-Nazaire. That really was dramatic.
This time, the object of the exercise was to put out of action the great dry dock in Saint-Nazaire Harbor, the only one on the Atlantic coast big enough to take the giant German battleship Tirpitz. This is the actual Combined Ops briefing model kept here at the Imperial War Museum. Our plan was to ram the gate of the dock with a ship crammed with high explosive, the old destroyer Campbelltown. It was a most hazardous business, with a long run-in under heavy fire from these batteries here and here and here. But the Campbelltown made it. Torpedoes were fired at the various harbor installations, and commandos were landed who carried out more demolitions. And the next day, when it was all over, and she was crowded with German officers inspecting her, the Campbelltown exploded and blew the balls sky high. But above all, the Tirpitz was never able to come out into the Atlantic.
It was just about at the time of the Saint-Nazaire raid that Mountbatten ceased to be the advisor on combined operations and became chief of combined operations. His elevation to the new rank, with a seat on the Chiefs of Staff's committee, was indeed a sensation. My own reaction, together with that of the other senior officers of his staff, was one of exhilaration, almost exultation. At one stride, our organization had penetrated the very center and citadel of power. We were now to work for a man with access to all the secrets, and for one who could and would be an advocate at top level for any plan, so long as he himself was convinced of its merit. For him personally, of course, it was a tremendous step to be a member of the redoubtable Chiefs of Staff Committee at the age of 42.
Now I was in on their discussions, and I sat with them here, in this row of chairs, when we met the Defense Committee or the War Cabinet itself in this historic room underneath Whitehall. Winston used to preside over the meetings in that chair over there.
To support his new status, Mountbatten received a remarkable promotion. From Commodore, he moved up the Navy list to acting Vice Admiral in his 42nd year. But this was not all. Mountbatten also became an honorary Lieutenant General and an honorary Air Marshal. The first time anyone except the King had held rank in the Navy, the Army, and the Air Force.
I got a great kick out of holding rank in all three services. Though in fact I never did dress up as a General or Air Marshal, because I had become a firm believer in inter-service cooperation. Indeed, it became a guiding principle right through the rest of my career. The men I was working with now were the professional heads of the three services. We were fortunate in having men of such ability in this crisis of the war. They were all a lot senior to me. Peter Porter was the nearest to me in age, 7 years older, and yet had risen to be Chief of the Air Staff. He showed me great friendship from the very beginning. Age, he told me, has nothing to do with this job. What matters is whether you know what you're doing and can hold your own. Admiral of the Fleet Sir Dudley Pound was the most distinguished of the chiefs. He was 23 years older than me. Now he was First Sea Lord. But despite our difference in rank and age, he was very friendly and helpful. It was he who explained to me why the Admiralty was so sticky about combined operations. The Navy was fighting the Battle of the Atlantic. If we lost that battle, the war would be lost. And in 1942, it seemed that this might very well happen. In the first 7 months of 1942, U-boats alone accounted for over 3 million tons of Allied shipping in the Atlantic, including 181 British ships. So it was not to be wondered at, after all, if the Admiralty looked askance at our demands for ships, shipbuilding facilities and men. But Dudley Pound did his best to help me get what I needed. He was getting very tired now. He died in harness the following year. And to lighten his burden, the chairmanship of the committee was taken over by the new Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Sir Alan Brooke. He was 17 years older than me, and a man of great character and ability. He always said exactly what he thought, even to Winston Churchill, who took it from him, and always called him by his nickname, Brookie. Alan Brooke had a wide inter-service view and a very incisive mind. I must mention one more man who played an absolutely vital part. He was General Sir Hastings Ismay, Pug Ismay, Churchill's personal representative, who always attended our meetings. He was the mediator. It was his never-failing tact which smoothed over many awkward moments and helped us to get our work done and reach the right conclusion without a fatal clash of wills with Winston.
On the other side of the Atlantic, in 1942, an astonishing spectacle was unfolding. America reacted to the disaster of Pearl Harbor with anger and characteristic imagination. Starting almost from scratch, the American government set in hand the raising of an army of 60 divisions, with 10 armored divisions. The production lines were created for 45,000 tanks and 45,000 aircraft. A stream of new ships pouring down the slipways would re-establish naval superiority in less than a year. This was mobilization on a grand scale. But it posed the question, how could this great array of force best be used?
In December 1941, Mr. Churchill went to Washington. He and Roosevelt met again, but now for the first time as allied leaders, not just to discuss, but to decide upon the conduct of a coalition war. Among the decisions which came out of their meetings, there were two of extraordinary importance. The first was America's Germany First strategy. This had been decided upon long before Pearl Harbor, but it was an act of amazing courage to stick to it after the Japanese attack. The second great decision resulted in the establishment of a committee known as the Combined Chiefs of Staff, in which the British Chiefs of Staff, or their representatives, could meet and discuss the great strategic issues of the war with the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. This machinery represented a degree of strategic cooperation unprecedented in the history of international relations. It did not, however, guarantee that the Chiefs of Staff, thus brought into contact, would necessarily always be in agreement.
I've described how Churchill's mind was working, how he gave me the directive to turn the south coast of England into a springboard for attack. This could only be for one purpose, the invasion of northwest Europe. It has often been suggested that the British were cool about this idea, while the Americans were all for it. We weren't cool, far from it. Everyone knew it had to be done. But after 2 years of indescribable difficulties and shortages, we were very much concerned with ways and means. And of course, we had certain other pressing problems too. For one thing, we had a major campaign on our hands in the Middle East. 2 days after Pearl Harbor, our 8th Army under General Ritchie relieved Tobruk after a siege of nearly 8 months. On December the 24th, we took Benghazi and cleared the Germans and Italians out of Cyrenaica. But then, General Rommel struck back. Once more, the desert campaign was in the balance. Reinforcements to the Middle East were diverted to deal with the Japanese, and the Battle of the Atlantic had yet to be won. All these things were using resources which we would need for the invasion of Europe.
In April 1942, General Marshall came to London, bent upon selling to the British the American belief that the Second Front in Europe must be opened in 1943, or even in the event of desperate need or exceptional opportunity in 1942. This 1942 idea, which was given the code name of Sledgehammer, was designed by the Americans to operate if either the Russians or the Germans showed signs of collapse. The British Chiefs of Staff were, of course, in complete agreement with the Americans that a second front in Europe must be opened. They therefore accepted Marshall's proposals in principle. The Americans thought that the acceptance was total, and this misunderstanding became the cause of injured relations and even suspicion. But all along, the British planners doubted the practicability of these operations in the time given, and particularly Sledgehammer in 1942.
Force commanders were actually appointed and set up their offices here in Combined Operations Headquarters to study the operation. It only took them a fortnight to confirm that any large-scale Anglo-American landing in 1942 was quite out of the question. This was unpalatable news for General Marshall, who was afraid that unless we got a move on in Europe, the US Navy and public opinion would insist on diverting American strength to the Pacific. It was during this visit that I started my friendship with Marshall. what an invaluable friendship that was. He was and remained the absolute key man in the American military effort all through the war. A terrific personality. On this occasion, he paid me the great compliment of asking, off his own bat, to come and inspect Combined Operations Headquarters, and he came round that very afternoon. He was really excited at the sight of Army, Navy, and Air Force officers all working together on joint projects. This is inspiring, he said. How have you done it? Well, I replied, it's very simple. They all speak English, so they can all understand each other. And then suddenly the penny dropped. And on the spur of the moment, I said, come to think of it, General, you Americans talk English too, after a fashion. Why don't you send over some American soldiers, sailors, and airmen to join us here in my headquarters? Marshall liked the idea, and that is how the first integrated Allied headquarters came into existence.
By mid-1942, the great Anglo-American debate was becoming rather sharp. The practical difficulties of opening a second front against the German army across the Channel from England and across the Atlantic from America were not at once grasped by the Americans, who were still very anxious to see their troops in action in 1942. The atmosphere of the debate was not helped by Russian insistence on an immediate second front, loudly backed by communists and others in Britain and America. Hard words began to fly, and worst of all, the strategic relations of Britain and America began to deteriorate. A meeting of Prime Minister and President again became an urgent necessity, and the ground needed particularly careful preparation. Lord Mountbatten, as the expert in amphibious warfare, was dispatched as the representative of the British Chiefs of Staff to tackle this delicate task. He arrived in Washington on June the 3rd, the very day of the Battle of Midway.
We couldn't appreciate it at the time, but this proved to be the turning point of the war against Japan. It was in this battle that the U.S. Navy regained the initiative and never lost it again. What I had to do in Washington on this occasion was probably my most important task of the whole war. I had to try and persuade Roosevelt and his advisors that our entire strategy needed rethinking. I pointed out that the Germans had 25 divisions stationed in France. With the pitiful number of landing craft we possessed, they could easily destroy any landing without shifting a single man from the Russian front. The Americans were rather shattered by this. Roosevelt was the first to grasp the point and to go on to the next question. What then could the British and Americans do in 1942? And this drew him back to something which he and Churchill had already tentatively discussed, the possibility of a landing, not in Europe, but in French North Africa. Once this was accepted, the subsequent Mediterranean strategy inevitably followed from it, the invasion of Sicily, and then Italy. And once these were underway, equally inevitably, the invasion of Northwest Europe had to be pushed back to 1944. I was already reaching the conclusion that this would in any case be the earliest date we could manage. But I wouldn't have dared say so in Washington bluntly in June 1942. What I did say, however, prepared the way for Churchill's next visit later in the month. The great debate didn't end with that, but stage by stage, the realities of the situation forced themselves on us and on the Americans, until finally in July, it was agreed that we must rule out Sledgehammer in 1942 and that we would invade North Africa in the autumn. So that became our target. And so the fundamental shape of the war was decided.
Into Mountbatten's headquarters flowed an endless stream of ideas and novelties, some of them nothing less than brilliant. Some not good at all. His own delight in gadgets became a legend. One of his staff officers wrote, "Mountbatten was a likely lad. A nimble brain Mountbatten had, and this most amiable trait. Of each new plan which came his way, he'd always claim in accents pat, "Why, I myself invented that," adding, when he remembered it for any scoffer's benefit, roughly the point in his career when he'd conceived the bright idea, as August 1934, or sometime during the Boer War.
Well, of course, I was never involved in any of your sort of official activities, and I could only hear what went on, from the outside, from hearsay. And of course, the stories that came out of Combined Operations Headquarters, you would have no idea. Of course, and the sort of things that we heard right down the line, was sort of cracks about the Combined Operations Headquarters as the only asylum which is run by its inmates. And judging by some of the extraordinary ideas that came out of it, it's not altogether untrue, is it? No, I think it was very necessary. We were faced with the biggest problem, I suppose, imaginable in military history, to prepare for this great invasion, which had never happened before, and so we were wide open to ideas, at least I was. But there were some that didn't quite come off, weren't there? The Grand Panjandrum, for instance. Well, the Great Panjandrum was an extraordinary thing that with 10-foot wheels and rockets driving the wheels and a ton of explosives run up against the wall. The only snag is you couldn't steer it. On its final trial, it got its speed up of 100 miles an hour, turned around, and attacked the people who'd launched it. Charming. So that was thrown out. But the need for new techniques of waging war, what some people condescendingly call gimmicks, had been unmistakably brought home to us. Combined Ops Headquarters had reached the conclusion that if our invasion was ever going to succeed, we must have a sheltered port. But could we capture one intact? No one knew, and none of us really knew what the problems and procedures would be of transporting a large army onto enemy-held beaches and maintaining them there. By mid-1942, we got an opportunity of answering both these vital questions. At last, we had enough landing craft to lift one division, so we decided to have a go at a port. Of course, it would have to be a port within range of air cover, and the choice had fallen on Dieppe. Combined Ops prepared the initial plans for the Dieppe raid, and after they had been approved by the Chiefs of Staff, handed them over to the responsible force commanders. The final touches were made by them while I was in America. I must say, I was rather astonished by some of them when I saw them.
The Dieppe raid was elaborately rehearsed. On August the 19th, 1942, the ill-fated raid took place. Bad weather nearly caused the raid to be cancelled, but Mountbatten insisted that it should take place. The bulk of the military forces engaged were Canadians, and what befell them shocked Canada and England. This was the baptism of fire of the Canadian soldiers, and the fire was murderous. Against unsubdued beach defenses, their losses reached over 65%. The Royal Regiment of Canada set out with 26 officers and over 500 men. Only 2 officers and 63 men returned. There were also heavy losses in the Royal Navy, the Commandos and the RAF. Dieppe had all the appearances of catastrophe.
Dieppe can only be called a catastrophe in the most immediate sense. The losses, of course, were very disturbing, yet it is some mitigation to remember that a high proportion of our casualties were taken prisoner, so they did at least survive. But costly as it was, Dieppe taught us lessons which had to be learned. Nothing like what we were planning to do had ever happened before. This was the only experience we had to go on, and I see no other way of learning the lessons than by experience. But above all, it helped me evolve what I call my philosophy of invasion. Dieppe, after all, was a raid, We never intended to do more than go in and come out again. The invasion itself would be quite a different matter. We would not only have to blast our way through every defense, but we would have to remain ashore. This meant building up our forces at a faster rate than the enemy could build up against us. It seemed to me that the problem resolved itself into three elements. First, there was the question of where to land. Clearly, a decisive factor would be the extent of air cover. This left us a fair number of places to choose from. Most senior commanders argued strongly for the shortest possible route, the Dover-Calais line. The Germans were convinced we'd come this way, and we encouraged this belief with an elaborate and very successful deception plan. But I was convinced that the longer way would prove to be the shortest way in the end. I stuck out for Normandy.
We in Combined Ops had all along assumed that no plan for invading France would do if it depended upon the immediate capture and use of a port. Dieppe confirmed beyond doubt that this was so. So fresh impetus was given to solving the problem of prolonged dependence upon open beaches. I myself was deeply disturbed at the prospect of maintaining an army rising to over 1 million men without a major port. But it was not until June 20 that I thought of the idea of a mobile, artificial harbour on a Napoleonic scale. From the very outset, Mountbatten was enthusiastic about this immense project. He released Sir Harold Urner to coordinate the project, and he threw all the weight of his great personal influence behind it. In the event, the artificial harbours known in history as Mulberry played a signal part in the invasion. Even more important, though, was the fact that without them, the entire operation would have been written off as too hazardous to attempt. Of that I am certain. This was just one more example of Mountbatten's enthusiasm for new ideas when they fitted in with his philosophy of invasion.
Finally, and this is where my scientists came in, headed by Sir Solly Zuckerman, there was what he called the interdiction plan. This was intended to prevent the enemy concentrating against us during the dangerous period of our build-up. Solly Zuckerman suggested that the Air Force should bomb all the road and rail junctions, bridges and tunnels along the German lines of communication and keep their reinforcements out of the invasion area.
The invasion of Europe was still a long way off in 1942. But in that year, the turning point of the war was reached. Field Marshal Rommel's advance into Egypt was halted at the end of August. In October, General Montgomery won the Battle of El Alamein, the decisive victory of the Desert War. Now Mountbatten's work began to produce great results. Operation Torch, the Allied landing in North Africa in November, was the largest combined operation yet seen. The supreme commander of the Allied forces was General Eisenhower, making his first impression in the public eye. By May 1943, his campaign was won. 250,000 Germans and Italians laid down their arms. The Axis was beaten in Africa. Already, new combined operations were being planned. In January, Mountbatten had attended the Casablanca Conference, at which the decision was taken to invade Sicily. The Allied planners dared not guess the full results of their decision. The fall of Mussolini in July. So fascism in Italy was beaten. The first of the dictators had been disposed of. Now the Allies prepared to land on the soil of Italy herself. And already the ultimate decision had been reached on the Eastern Front. The German surrender at Stalingrad was the first of a series of Russian victories which would cripple Germany. Only in the Far East was the news still bad. On Guadalcanal, the Americans were discovering the terrible tenacity of the Japanese soldier in defense. In Burma, the British were defeated again. Nothing seemed to go right in that sector of the war. Once more, the Allied leaders gathered, this time at Quebec. They had much to discuss. Among other things, the creation of a new Southeast Asia Command, which would include Burma, and the appointment of a supreme Allied commander. On August the 22nd, Churchill noted, "The President and General Marshal are very keen on Mountbatten's appointment. There is no doubt of the need of a young and vigorous mind in this lethargic and stagnant Indian scene."
I wanted desperately to go back in command of a ship. It was a shock when Winston told me what they wanted me to do instead. I asked for 24 hours to think it over. Why, he asked, "Don't you think you can do it?" I replied, I had a congenital weakness for thinking I could do anything. But I wanted to know how each of the British and American chiefs of staffs really felt about it. When I found I had their full backing, and above all President Roosevelt's, of course I accepted right away.
So the announcement was made officially from the Citadel at Quebec. It has been decided to set up a separate Southeast Asia Command for conducting operations based on India and Ceylon against Japan. The King has been pleased to approve the appointment of Acting Vice Admiral the Lord Louis Mountbatten, GCVO DSO ADC, to be Supreme Allied Commander, Southeast Asia. Just over 4 months later, the Supreme Allied Commander for the invasion of Europe was appointed, General Dwight D. Eisenhower of the U.S. Army. General Eisenhower, Ike to his armies and his friends, had displayed his great talent for getting men of many nations to work together. Now the implementation of the invasion plan in all its complexity would be up to him.
From the very beginning, Admiral Mountbatten, Dickie I always called him, was an enthusiastic supporter of this plan. The first thing he did that I can recall was to come to see me, and we together began going over all the reasons for choosing a particular area for attack. A number of the people thought we should go to Calais, which is just the shortest distance, of course, but for a number of reasons that he advanced, we came to the conclusion that we should land in the Cherbourg area and east thereof as far as Caen. There's where we finally landed. Now, just after the attack started, the American chiefs of staff came over to visit us in the beachhead. It was just a week after D-Day, as I recall. And after touring the beach, they sent this telegram to Admiral Mountbatten. "Today we visited the British and American armies on the soil of France. We sailed through vast fleets of ships with landing craft of many types, pouring more men, vehicles, and stores ashore. We saw clearly the maneuver in process of rapid development. We have shared our secrets in common and helped each other all we could. We wish to tell you at this moment in your arduous campaign that we realize that much of this remarkable technique and therefore the success of the venture has its origin in developments effected by you and your staff of combined operations." This was signed by General Arnold and General Marshall, Admiral King for the Americans, and by the Prime Minister, Field Marshal Smuts, and General Brooke for the British side. I'm sure that that telegram meant a very great deal to my old friend Dickie Mountbatten.